Hello, my name is Sven Spieker. I don't think I've ever been this comfortable when giving a talk. I shall just be leaning back. I'd like to thank everybody, especially the organizers of this conference, Krzysztof and Carolina, for inviting me. And my paper will be devoted to a topic that interests me a great deal, and that is the relationship between archives and disorder. But I'll also be tying this theme or this interest to the work of an artist who has worked a great deal with photography and video, namely Antoni Muntadas. The archive is generally treated as an institution founded on order and systematic storage. Yet, from the earliest times, the degradation of information has been an inextricable part of its operations. On the one hand, this is due to the external threats that affect the archive from outside. Yet, on the other hand, disorder and entropy threaten the archive also on its inside. As media formats change, information becomes obsolete and dissolves. In addition, fire, water, and all kinds of bugs may affect what the archive stores. In the digital age, the inevitable degradation of information stored on the internet has been the topic of much recent debate. The question then is if entropy, rather than affecting the archive from without, might be considered instead an element that is intrinsic to its operations. Freud certainly seemed to think so, as Jacques Derrida and others have explained. In contemporary art, the multiple effects of entropy and the way in which they affect archival operations have been an issue for some time, and never more so than during the late 1960s and 70s, when conceptual artists promoted the rise of information as art. What conceptual art promoted was not merely, as has been said, an aesthetic of administration, but also an inquiry into how information dwindles and deteriorates. In my talk, I want to pursue these issues in the work of an artist who began his career in the 1970s and whose work with archives betrays the legacy of conceptual art at every step, Antoni Muntadas. In his work, Muntadas critically engages mass media that network and disseminate information, intersecting in various ways with archives and databases and their truth claims. More specifically, Muntadas questions and critiques a certain traditional understanding of the archive as a stable repository of knowledge. By carefully contextualizing the information he works with, by showing that no archive can remain unaffected by the context in which it operates, the artist demonstrates that there is no such thing as universal information. There is only information in specific formats and contexts and tied to equally specific modes of emission and reception. In these variegated contexts and technical conditions, information is subject to the possibility that its own integrity may be under threat from the effects of entropy. And now I would like to make a short digression before returning to Muntadas on more generally the theme of entropy and its relationship, or its possible relationship, with archives. And this is more of a historical digression. Perhaps the first law of thermodynamics, with its stipulation based on the experiments by James Joule in the 1840s, that energy is conserved in all processes, is the more inherently archival. Yet perhaps it is quite fitting that in the era of historicism in the late 19th century, with its belief in history as a series of aggregate states, it was the second law with its idea that the entropy of an isolated system always increases inexorably, dissipating useful energy, that gained the upper hand. The 19th century archive conceived of historical time as a linear series of aggregate states, and it is in this respect, and not with regard to the common perception that entropy is disorder, that it comes closest to the second law of thermodynamics. In an archive, we study not history, but the effects of time as a series of present states. Entropy, in its turn, is a way of measuring the different aggregate states, especially the beginning and the end stage, that a closed system can occupy over a specific period of time. Disorder here is nothing more and nothing less than a term used to describe such a shift from one aggregate state to another. From the point of view of entropy, disorder is not the same as messiness. As Rudolf Arnheim remarks in his essay on art and entropy, quote, "A child that messes up its room by dispersing or even breaking the toys in it is a very inefficient randomizer. Failing to grind his belongings to a powder of independent molecules, he has preserved islands of untouched order everywhere. In fact, it is only because of this failure that the state of his room can be called disorderly. Disorder is not the absence of all order, but rather the clash of uncoordinated orders," unquote. From the point of view of entropy, order is what Arnheim calls an improbable arrangement of elements, let's say the way in which molecules are held together in a medical pill, while disorder is the destruction of such an improbable arrangement, say when that same pill dissolves in water and its molecules arrange themselves in new ways. It is important to realize that this statement says nothing about the structure of such a new arrangement. So, a system that has a high degree of entropy, say an archive, can at the same time be perfectly ordered. As Max Planck writes, pure thermodynamics, quote, "regards all substances as absolutely continuous," unquote. This statement may limit the usefulness of entropy, understood in this strict sense, for archive theory, as archives are not continuous but clearly structured. Or perhaps it depends on our perspective. Do we view the archive from a molecular perspective, the perspective of, say, files and folders, or do we view it from the perspective of, let's say, registries or other larger conglomerates of information? Regardless, entropy does not make statements about structure or about order and disorder as structural properties of a macro state. It merely measures such states. Ever since Ludwig Boltzmann, entropy has also involved the study of aggregate states of disorder on a statistical basis. And it is statistical entropy, that is to say, the effort to predict the number of microstates that a certain system can occupy, that became crucial for the use of entropy in information theory. Think of Norbert Wiener or Shannon, where order, that is an improbable or unlikely arrangement of elements, is defined as information. That is, information is what is not easily predictable. In other words, information is the opposite of entropy if entropy is understood as the dissolution of such improbable orderly states, suggesting greater probability. To transmit a message full of information is to induce order, that is, increased improbability, the opposite of entropy. Quote, "The less likely an event is to happen, the more information does its occurrence represent," unquote. As Arnheim also makes clear, the approaches of information theory and entropy are to a certain extent contradictory, since unlike information theory, entropy is actually not at all concerned with sequences or series of elements. To the information theorist, the least structured series, that is, the series with the highest degree of improbability, and hence the ones that contains the most information, may at the same time be the most orderly, since information equals order. And conversely, the entropy theorist is not concerned with series of individual items or elements, only with aggregate states and how these add up to macro states. And after this brief digression, I want to talk about the work of a contemporary artist whom I already mentioned, Muntadas, and the use he may or may not make of entropic states. Antoni Muntadas, who, as I said before, works specifically with photography and video, is specifically interested in entropic archives or archival states with a high degree of disorder and, more importantly, sudden changes That is, archives that challenge our assumption that the knowledge stored in an archive is immune to change, or that it can even be conceived as such outside of the dynamic processes of its transmission, translation, or communication. It is doubtful, indeed, if there can be such a thing as an archive devoted to the process of translation itself. In an archive, it is always a matter of documents whose ontological status is stable. There is no archival system that could account easily for texts in a state of emergence, at least when we're talking about analog archives. In Muntadas, by contrast, it is often a matter of combining the stable hardware of the archive with documentary material that is in flux or whose aggregate state is subject to sudden unforeseen changes. Often these changes occur as a result of information being transmitted between a sender and an addressee. This can take many forms, from the way in which translations change a text to the noise generated by television emissions, or even the transmission of information from our sense organs to the brain. In all these different instances of information transfer, the channels along which the information travels do not function as neutral carriers that remain unaffected by what they deliver. Instead, the process of transmission itself becomes an inalienable part of the message it transports. As Muntadas himself has said, quote, "How we read information has to do with our subjective and objective processing of the information as we encounter it. The nature and volume of the transmission and of our reception, along with our cultural, historical, and space-time conceptions, affect our determination of the character of the message." Unquote. The gap that separates the emission of a message from its reception was the focus of the video installations Emisión-Recepción and The Last 10 Minutes, both from the early 1970s. So this is Emisión. Actually, this is Emisión-Recepción. And then this is, so basically you had two projected images showing photographs with, on the one hand, television programs from the official Spanish television station, and then on the right-hand side, images capturing different people in different localities watching these or other programs, but clearly separated. And then there is The Last 10 Minutes, where in this work from the late 1970s, this work involved the simultaneous playback of the last minutes of evening television programs from 3 different countries. This change in the aggregate state of information from television to tape directly affected the program's message. Yeah? So this was a video shown, a video that had captured these television programs and was then shown in the gallery. As a result of these and similar changes, for instance, in the wake of a change in the recording format, the archive sheds its air of transparency and readability, becoming opaque and potentially unreadable. Muntadas provided a succinct illustration of such unreadability in another work entitled The Message, one of the works from his translation cycle. In The Message, the artist Claudia Canizzaro forwarded Muntadas an email message with the subject line, "Atto politico," political act. However, the value of this political act was difficult to establish since the forwarded message contained only noise, an illustration of the fact that the successful transmission of information, especially where it involves compression, always has to contend with increased entropy, i.e., with the possibility that part or even all of its contents may be unreadable. This, Muntadas seems to suggest, does not preclude the possibility for a political act to come into existence, atto politico. What it does mean, however, is that we should not equate political acts with full transparency and uncompromised readability. Just as noise can be subversive, so can dynamic processes that favor the dynamic process of transmission and compression over decipherment and transparency. In the early 1920s, the physicist and father of the Manhattan Project, Leo Szilard, developed a theoretical model that linked heat engines with information engines, establishing a connection between thermodynamics, the manipulation and transfer of energy on the one hand, and information on the other. In his paper, quote, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, Claude Shannon took up Szilard's idea, arguing that the transmission of information bits in bits is never a straightforward process, but that it involves the possibility of disorder, degradation, and data loss as the data make its way through a noise-filled communications channel. To Shannon, entropy was a measure of unpredictability. Muntada's work also shows a high degree of unpredictability, beginning with the artist's attitude to the display of his own work in exhibitions. What I have in mind here is the idea, Muntada's idea, that certain of his works can be, or even should be, translated every time they are exhibited in a new venue. So they're never the same, they merely exist as an idea which is then translated differently by every curator who reenacts these installations. While on the one hand, this idea simply responds to the technical necessity of adapting the visual deployment of a work to a new exhibition context, it also speaks to Muntada's roots in conceptual art practice of the 1970s, with its assumption that the material from an artwork takes its that the material form an artwork takes is secondary to its elaboration as an idea. Yet, contrary to the more orthodox practitioners of conceptual art, Muntadas does not adopt their axiomatic elevation of the idea over its material form wholesale. His approach is more reminiscent of Mikhail Bakhdin's understanding of polyphony. A work of art may exist in a variety of potential visual actualizations, a set of latencies or possibilities, without any single one of them being elevated above the others. In another work from the translation project, El Aplauso, which was realized among other things in Bogota in 1999, all these works have had many incarnations in different places and they look different in each place. But here's one of them. I think this is the way this looked in Bogota in the late 1990s. So in this work, Muntadas alternated a projected color image of an audience clapping its hands with black and white images of violence from the drug conflict in Colombia. These images, placed in between the two images of applause, change at such a rapid pace that the viewer can hardly see them. And this is a technique that Muntadas had also used. So sometimes in the middle you have an image of applause, and then at rapid and unpredictable intervals you have images projected that are taken from newspaper, images taken from the Colombian drug conflict. Muntadas had used a similar technique in an installation called This Is Not an Advertisement in the mid-1980s. The ephemeral presence of these images upsets the triptych-like symmetry of the two other images and injects a disquieting element of unpredictability into the installation. In this instance, the value of information, that is, the sudden displays of violent imagery, can only be measured by our own inability to prepare for its appearance. In an illuminating essay about El Aplauso, José Ignacio Roca has explained that the Colombian media had formed a habit of packaging the frightening unpredictability of life in Colombia by producing presentation formats that reduced the situation and the drug wars more generally to the utterly predictable elements in a never-changing series of entertainment. He writes, El Aplauso by Muntadas shows up the treatment of violent events by the local media and the passive and cynical attitude they have generated in the audience, unquote. In his installation, Muntadas sought to return to information and as a disquieting tendency to shatter established systems, returning well-ordered normalcy to a palpable sense of disorder. El Aplauso and other works show that the reduction of unpredictability that is a hallmark of mass media, quote, as Muntadas himself said, shows are presented by the producers, managers, conductors, etc. through packaging to submerge the audience in a conscious, unconscious state of leisure. The audience is then trapped and consumed. That this formatting is but a thin veneer of ordered sense over a violent abyss of utter unpredictability and entropy. Far from being a bastion of stability that ensures that messages can reach their sender in an unadulterated form, the meaning of messages is threatened by this entropy at its very core. So entropy, thought of as a change in the aggregate state of information, affects Muntadas' work with stored knowledge at every level. In another installation entitled File Room, perhaps his best known from the early 1990s, this was a hybrid installation that blurred the line between office, archive, and database. So File Room grafted the digital storage of information. As we can see here, you have these old-fashioned filing cabinets that surround a computer terminal in the middle. And remember, this is the early 1990s. Grafts the digital storage of information on old-fashioned, earlier 20th century office hardware. Black filing cabinets, some of them containing computers with their screens in the front, you can see them shining, surround a computer workstation at the center of the installation, making the room even darker except for the light from the computer screens themselves. The central computer, like its satellites in the cabinets, is linked to an interactive database collecting instances of censorship all over the world. In this file room, the analog cabinets are already empty. Archive technologies change over time, and the information they once may have contained in the form of paper files has migrated to a new digital platform. And so, as a location or an archival site, File Room is already much closer to a computer screen than to an actual office situation, the archive that is, as a virtual interface. The installation once again presents us with an instance of transfer and translation from the digital information to the analog files hinted at in the filing cabinets, and hence with the possibility that information may be lost in the process. The presence of two different storage technologies, the computer and the filing cabinet at the center of the work, also allegorizes the difficulties involved in any transfer of information from one medium to another, or indeed from a sender to an addressee. And they hint that censorship, which is the theme of the installation, and which can here broadly be understood as the loss of information, is not only a deplorable political practice in many parts of the world, but also perhaps part and parcel of the technical operation we call communication. In another work, for which unfortunately I do not have an image, called The Bookstore from the early 2000s, the change in the aggregate state of information involved the deconstruction of the traditional understanding of archives as systems that remain impervious to what they contain. In this work, Muntadas pits an 18th century model for the representation of knowledge based on stable categories that subsume heterogeneous pieces of knowledge under them with the 20th century critique of that model. So what he did was the artist visited several bookstores in the US and Britain and took photographs of the signs. I mean, if there were still bookstores in the US, but unfortunately we're moving to a point where that's no longer the case, but he visited several bookstores in the US and Britain and took photographs of the signs that guide visitors to the various categories of books, such as art, science fiction, games, and so on. And then in his presentation of these photographs that he had taken, Muntadas confronted the abstract stability of the universal categories under which the books had been grouped at the stores with the utter heterogeneity of the book formats subsumed under them. And so the montage-like clash between these two elements, the books all of various, of different sizes and different formats, and the categories that seem to sort of stably arrange them, the clash between these two elements translated visually into the confrontation of a grid that is the basic form of an archive conceived as an empty container with the messy contents of the images of which it is composed. The 18th century archive of universal knowledge, Muntadas seemed to argue, has to contend with the inescapable entropy of what it tries to contain. In his earlier action action-based work from the early 1970s, when Muntadas began as a conceptual artist in Spain, he focused on the isolation of certain sense perceptions and on the way, and in a way this is his work that perhaps in some sense is most interesting to me. He had focused on sense perceptions and on the way in which they can or cannot be isolated as part of an artistic practice, and on the way in which such isolation might affect the transmission of information from our sense organs to our brain. So in actions such as smelling areas, manipulables, collective experience, or smell, touch, and taste, all from the early 1970s, he had individuals interact with an object or environment through their senses. So you can see this here, where he had people often blindfolded, trying to isolate sense perceptions by having their hands touch on barbed wire or their feet walking through mud, and then communicate these experiences. Again, often shutting other sense organs, so you would be concentrating only on your smell, on your hearing, or on your eyesight. By isolating specific channels for the transmission of sensory information, Muntadas freed them, at least temporarily, from their domination by the higher senses of seeing and hearing. It tended to be seeing, the eyes that were shut off, or sometimes the ears, and the idea was that the tactile sense would be the one you relied on. For example, the participants might have their eyes and ears closed off so that they relied solely on their sense of touch for the exploration and identification of the object or objects they confronted. In the case of experience number 3, 13 people, all of them blindfolded, explored an enclosed space with their hands and feet. So groping here was a form of knowledge acquisition, which is actually a very experimental scientific model. The point to these exercises was less the identification of an object than its production as an integrated gestalt in a multi-tiered process of transcription or translation over time. Of course, such transfers of information from the object to the hand or noise and then to the brain are subject to multiple misreadings. And once again, it is this element, disorder thwartening all attempts at systematic recognition, that interests Muntadas most of all. The anti-retinal impulse behind some of these early works point, on the one hand, to the Duchampian strain of early 20th century art, with its rejection of the retinal as art's primary domain. However, with Muntadas, it is less a matter of simply rejecting visuality than of giving non-visual sense perceptions such as smell, touch, and taste, as he said, the same opportunity for development as the audio-visual senses, unquote. A crucial part of this increased emphasis on the so-called lower senses is the slowing down of the perceptual process. By temporarily freeing them from domination by sight or hearing, Muntadas forced his participants to take detours, groping around for an object or environment whose specific contours defied easy visual or verbal summary. In a manner reminiscent of Bataille, Muntadas reformats our culturally encoded predisposition to view eyesight and correspondingly reason and intellect as the privileged organs of a body organized along a vertical axis and freed ideally from the effects of entropy. In an experimental fashion, Muntadas attempts to produce a kind of body without organs, which, as Deleuze has pointed out repeatedly, is not literally a body without organs, but a body where the traditional hierarchy that governs the disposition of its organs has been upset. As a site of perception, the body without organs, much like Muntadas' body, does not capture its object in an instant, but relies instead on a series of steps whose integration produces the perceived object as an object of our imagination. In the history of science, it was Freud who speculated already early in his career that sensory perception proceeds in different stages or registrations, each corresponding to different memory resources in the human brain that function like transcriptions. With that hint at Muntadas' early work, maybe I'll stop and perhaps we can discuss some matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sven. I think it was a brilliant idea by the organizers of the conference to have Sven Spieker from the University of California to start this conference, because he's both a theorist of the archive, having introduced the very central notion of entropy, which is the ultimate enemy of the archive, and at the same time introducing us to archival art, the Montadas works, and of course, for all who want to read more about that, Sven Spieker's book on art and bureaucracy and the archive develops on this subject. Now, our plan is to have half an hour talk and to leave time for a short discussion, which will take place now. Afterwards, there will be a second presentation, then there will be a coffee break, and then there will be 2 more talks. So, I'm happy to open the discussion. Who dares? Normally, I know the first lecture is always followed by silence, but who dares to break? My role, chairing, is always then to put the first question. Do you think that you showed the famous piece, the filing room, where you say, I didn't know that the old filing cabinets are empty, because now paper is being replaced by electronic information flow. Actually, we all know it from our old practice. In the age of computerized archivization, there is more paper than ever. And even you have your paper, you read it from your paper. What do you say about this double existence of the material classical archive and the information-based archive? Is it one following the other, or is it a more complicated relation?
I mean, I should say that that idea that this file room represents a kind of a moment of transition, or sort of allegorizes it, that is not, I mean, I made that up fully, yeah? That was, because generally interpretations of the file room are more concerned with its interest in, you know, human rights, censorship, and so on. But I think it's much more an installation about the media and precisely about this moment of transition. And I think it can be read either in this kind of optimistic, emphatic key, yeah? That is to say, you really do read these filing cabinets as empty because you assume that somehow paper will be consumed by the digital. Or indeed, since they're not open, you can assume that paper and the digital coexist in some ways, and that coexistence, you know, I mean, really, I think what the installation shows is the cusp, that is to say, the transition point from the one to the other. So I don't know if it's a matter of deciding which, you know, whether there's an actual replacement of paper by the digital. I find it more interesting to think of them as existing side by side. Yeah?
Yeah, thank you for this different reading of this famous piece by Montadas. John Tagg?
Yeah. But couldn't one say that the filing cabinet is always empty, in that the filing system isn't physically in the shelf? It's the network of cross-references and substitutions that make up the basis of the filing system. So in that sense, I wonder about this term, the analog file, because the filing cabinet is just as much a virtual space as the computer terminal.
You mean in the sense that but I mean physically a filing cabinet is full of paper, generally speaking. Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, in that sense, of course, you're right. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah. You right. You could also extend that and say there is, of course, an element of virtuality in the fact that these files network with other files that exist only virtually, but nevertheless, to which it sort of alludes all the time. So yeah, no, of course.
But maybe the younger generation knows the word file only as a computer file, but file, of course, used to be a very material, tangible thing. A file, as every classical archivist knows, has even weight. I mean, a file takes space on the shelves. And I think maybe that is exactly the point which Sven Spieker wanted to discuss. What is the strange relation between the materiality of the archive and the information, the media theory of the archive, and that we are still in this age of transition between both. It's not that we are now living in the electronic age and before there was the traditional paper-based archive age, but the relation, we are still in the moment of transition now.
Yeah.
Since John Tagg already pronounced his voice, maybe then we can invite him to go to the floor. Thank you, Sven, once more.